Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We're a little bit later, first a day late because of the Labor Day weekend, and then a little bit later on in the day as far as when I usually upload, because this was a big episode to prep. We are looking at the entire summer box office. I'm giving you my winners and losers as far as movies. I'm giving you my outlook on how each individual Big Five studio did this summer. So we have a lot of ground to cover. Let's just jump right down into it and get to the weekend box office first. It was the Labor Day weekend here in the United States, which means it was a 4-day weekend. Let's look first at the 3-day weekend box office numbers. Debuting at number 1 was Denzel Washington's The Equalizer 3 at $34.6 million. It actually did well when you look at the Labor Day weekend overall. We'll look at that in just a moment. Barbie, in its 7th week, remains in second place, a 32.4% drop and a $10.2 million total. Its domestic total now stands at over $600 million. Blue Beetle in week 3 drops 41.5% for a total at $7.1 million. Gran Turismo doesn't hold up that great, 62% in week 2 and a $6.6 million 3-day total. Given the positive audience reception, you would have hoped, or I think the studio would have hoped, that it would hold a little bit better than that. Oppenheimer's still in the top 5 in its 7th week, a 30% drop, the best drop in the top 5, and a $5.7 million total. Its domestic total is now at over $300 million. In 6th place was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem at $4.6 million. It has now eclipsed the $100 million domestic total. Bottoms had a big expansion to over 700 theaters and a 561% increase in business from its first week where it was in just a handful of theaters. A $3 million total for the 3-day weekend and a domestic total at over $4.5 million. Meg 2, The Trench is in 8th place with $2.8 million. Strays is in 9th place with $2.5 million. And one of the quietest success stories this summer, Talk to Me, in its 6th week is still in the top 10 with $1.7 million for the 3-day weekend and a domestic total approaching $45 million. Not bad for a movie produced on a budget of about $4 million. So that was the 3-day weekend. Let's look at the numbers when you look at the Friday through Monday Labor Day weekend, and the order of everything remains the same. The Equalizer 3 is at number 1 with $42.8 million. Barbie at number 2 with $13.4 million. Blue Beetle raises its take to $9.4 million in 3rd place, followed by Gran Turismo at $8.7 million and Oppenheimer at $7.6 million. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem stays at number 6 at $6.2 million. A tough race here, though, for 7th and 8th. Bottoms stays at number 7 with $3.8 million, but Meg 2 The Trench was only about $200,000 behind at $3.6 million, and Strays there at number 9 with $3.2 million, so very close clustering between 7 through 9, and then Talk to Me there at number 10 at $2.2 million for the 4-day weekend. Dropping out of the top 10 were 2 movies that were there for just 1 week, the real-life sports story The Hill and Liam Neeson's latest film, Retribution. And when we look at the most theaters lost this Labor Day weekend, it's a couple of movies that may surprise you. The number 1 movie is The Little Mermaid because it added a bunch of theaters for National Cinema Day. There was the movie itself, and then there was a sing-along version that was also in a bunch of theaters. It dropped 1,349 theaters. It's now in just about 251 theaters. And another movie that may be surprising to see, the Super Mario Brothers movie. It drops 1,324 theaters. It remains in only 127 theaters. And something that people might not know is that the movie has not closed. It's not like the movie was re-released for National Cinema Day. It's been playing through the entire spring and summer box office season. Now, it's probably going to close next week or the week after, but still, this movie has been playing for weeks now. It's like an old school movie in that it's played for, I think, about 6 months at this point. Pretty impressive for a family film in this box office environment. The Last Voyage of the Demeter is on its last voyage. It dropped 1,185 theaters last weekend. It's now in only 196. Strays is also starting to shed theaters. It dropped 746 theaters. It's now in 2,486 theaters total. And then Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning sheds another 715 theaters. It is now technically out of wide release. It's now in only 965 theaters. That 1,000 theater threshold is what I consider to be wide release. The Super Mario Brothers movie has not closed yet, but there were a couple of movies that did close. And when I say close, it means that they stopped reporting grosses. So I cannot track those movies anymore. That's not to say there might not be one or two theaters here or there that are playing the film, but it has largely left theaters nationwide. And they're both success stories, and both success stories from the same studio. One of those movies is Insidious: The Red Door, which ends an 8-week domestic run with a domestic gross of $82 million and an international gross at over $105 million. The worldwide gross stands at $188 million. I estimate that the movie is going to turn at least a $22.9 million theatrical profit, meaning only taking in the box office ticket sales, which means that anything as far as video on demand or digital rentals, any of that stuff, that just adds to that profit margin. So this is a hit. This is a success for Sony and the Insidious franchise. Another big hit for Sony is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which after 13 weeks ended its run in domestic theaters. Its domestic gross is at $381.2 million. Internationally, it made $308.1 million for a worldwide gross of $689.3 million. And I estimate a theatrical profit of around $125 million, keeping in mind this doesn't include any of the other ancillary markets, including promotional tie-ins, like I said, digital rentals, physical media sales. So Across the Spider-Verse is going to be a very, very profitable movie for Sony, and we're going to talk a lot more about it in just a few minutes. This chart compares the total box office this weekend with the combined weekend averages of 2021 and 2022, which was when theaters reopened following the pandemic, and then the 5 years preceding the pandemic, 2015 through 2019, and it's just to kind of see where we compare against those two time frames. And you'll see that we're still just barely below the average from the pre-pandemic times. That was when the highest grossing movie out of that 5-year span was the release of Don't Breathe, but we're well above where we were for the average of the last 2 years when the highest grossing film was Nia DaCosta's reimagining of Candyman. That's a movie that I still really enjoyed. So we are definitely hewing closer to where we were pre-pandemic than where we have been since theaters reopened, which is good news. Looking outside of the domestic box office, let's look at the top 5 films internationally. So these are all movies outside of the United States and Canada. Number 1 is Oppenheimer with $49.7 million, largely because it continues to play in overseas markets and also opened in China this past weekend, where it looks like it might be building up some steam. The Equalizer 3 is in second place with $26.1 million, followed by China's No More Bets at $16.7 million, Barbie at $13.2 million, and then Sound of Freedom. After a very successful and lucrative domestic run, Sound of Freedom is now rolling out internationally and brings in $10 million in its opening weekend. When you take those international totals, you combine them with our domestic totals, we get our top 5 films worldwide, and that puts The Equalizer 2 on top with a $60.7 million worldwide debut. But Oppenheimer is a close second, and its business actually went up almost 50% from last weekend worldwide, again, because it is rolling out in those markets. So Oppenheimer, not close to done yet. It may be picking up a little bit of momentum. Barbie's in third place, a 29.7% drop worldwide from last weekend and a $23.4 million total. Then No More Bets, which is starting to lose a little bit more business week over week, a 50% drop from last week and a $16.7 million total. And then Gran Turismo holds a little bit better worldwide than it did domestically, a 46.1% drop and a worldwide total of $15.3 million. Before I get into the summer box office, there is another upcoming box office story, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, and that is the shocking announcement that on October 13th, a Taylor Swift concert film will be hitting theaters nationwide. The Taylor Swift Eras Tour movie will be hitting theaters on Friday, October 13th, and the distribution is being done by AMC in their theaters, but also cooperatively with other theaters, and pre-sales for the movie reportedly have been massive. According to some distributors and ticket sellers, we're talking about an MCU level of pre-sales for this film, perhaps an opening weekend gross of over $100 million. And this is one of those things that's a surprising story, but also a welcome one, because the fall box office season is losing movies left and right. It lost Dune Part 2. This should get people back into theaters, and the studios are on the sidelines here. They had no idea this was even happening, and in the wake of this announcement, the release date for Exorcist the Believer, Driver, which was supposed to come out on Friday, October 13th, got moved up a week because Universal said we're not competing with that. So that movie is now coming out on Friday, October 6th. There's been some word that the studios are a little frustrated that they were left out of the loop. But you know what? The studios have been leaving a lot of people out of the loop lately. So I'm not really that concerned about their feelings on this matter. This could be interesting though, because I think we're entering unprecedented territory for a concert or a live musical performance film. These are the top earning concert or musical performance films thus far domestically. This doesn't include things like live stand-up comedy. This is just music. Justin Bieber's Never Say Never is the top earning concert film at $73 million, and it's possible that the Taylor Swift Eras Tour movie could bypass this final gross in its opening weekend. Then we have Michael Jackson's This Is It at $72 million. Hannah Montana and Miley Cyrus, Best of Both Worlds concert at $65.2 million. Then One Direction, This Is Us at $28.8 million. And Katy Perry, Part of Me at $25.3 million. And you see there that we had a little bit of a pop, a little bit of a boost on this genre about 10 years ago, but not a whole lot of people have ventured into it as far as a wide theatrical release. We've seen some weekend events here and there, particularly with a lot of K-pop bands. But this is a story that nobody really saw coming. And in case you're wondering, yes, I did get a ticket. Yes, I will be going on its opening night. I'm a Taylor Swift fan. I mean, I'm not a Taylor Swift fan. I enjoy her breakout hits, but I'm really kind of going just for the experience because I've heard so much about this concert tour. I kind of want to see what the atmosphere and the environment is. And yes, I will put a video out here on the channel to detail my experience because this is a box office show and this is a movie channel and this is one of the biggest theatrical events of the year. And I'm really excited to take part in it. So I didn't want to go through the rest of these box office stories without mentioning that. Stay tuned right here next week because we will be covering this surprise story extensively as we get into the October movie season. So let's look at the all-time Labor Day openings before we look backwards at the rest of the summer. I mentioned that The Equalizer 3 did well for the Labor Day weekend. It actually put up the second best opening for any movie ever on Labor Day. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings holds the best Labor Day opening of all time just 2 years ago at $94.6 million, but The Equalizer 3 is in second place at $42.8 million, followed by 2007's Rob Zombie Halloween at $30.5 million back in 2007, The Possession at just over $21 million back in 2012, and then Transporter 2 at just over $20 million back in 2005. Labor Day typically not a very competitive time for films, but we've seen, as you can see recently, other movies that have entered that spot. Looking at the highest four-day grosses for all movies domestically, so whether they were opening or not, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings and The Equalizer 3 both still holding the number 1 and number 2 spot. The third highest performing film on Labor Day weekend all time was The Sixth Sense in its fifth week of release back in 1999 at $35.6 million. Unadjusted for inflation, it would be above Equalizer 3 if you were to adjust for inflation. Then 2007's opening of Halloween and the third week of Crazy Rich Asians, which made $28.5 million over the Labor Day weekend back in 2018. This was also a top 5 opening for Denzel Washington. His biggest opening 3-day weekend was American Gangster back in 2007 at $43.5 million, followed by Safe House in 2012 at just over $40 million. Then we had the July 2018 opening of The Equalizer 2 at $36 million, 2016's Magnificent Seven, which opened at $34.7 million, and then The Equalizer 3, which is just under that number this Labor Day at $34.6 million. Those last 3 films, all collaborations between Denzel Washington and director Antoine Fuqua, so they have had a very lucrative partnership. Of course, Denzel's had a very long career, so when you adjust those numbers for inflation, they actually don't really change that much. American Gangster's still number 1 at $64.2 million, followed by Safe House at $53.4 million. 2010's The Book of Eli comes in third, adjusted for inflation, at $45.9 million, followed by 2016's The Magnificent Seven, and then a different Equalizer film, the first Equalizer film back in 2014, at just over $44 million. Taking a look at some of the movies in the top 10, Barbie continues to set records for Warner Brothers, and it has now officially become the highest grossing film in Warner Brothers history worldwide. It has bypassed Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. It's now at $1.384 billion. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows was at $1.342 billion, so that's great news for Barbie. Also, Barbie moving up the list of highest grossing Warner Brothers films all time, adjusted for inflation domestically. It has passed The Dark Knight Rises and is now at number 4 on that list, and it will soon bypass 1989's Batman for number 3 on the list, which is probably where it will wind up. So another big success story for Barbie. I mentioned a sequel to The Exorcist coming out later this year. The original Exorcist, number 1 on this list at almost $1.4 billion domestically if you adjust for inflation. Also looking at the highest grossing films of the 2020s worldwide, Barbie has moved past the Super Mario Brothers movie, which if you do the math also means it's now the highest grossing movie of the year for 2023 worldwide. It's now less than $100 million behind Top Gun Maverick for number 3 on this list, so we'll see what kind of momentum it can maintain. But even if it stays there at number 4, that's still a great success. And looking at Barbie versus other top grossers of the 2020s domestically, that black line that's going off the chart, that's Spider-Man No Way Home. That just goes to show you how successful that movie is. But really look at this horse race here. For a long time, Avatar: The Way of Water, which is the blue line there, was lagging behind Barbie. It has now overtaken Barbie. And Top Gun Maverick, which is that green line, again, look at it closing that gap. I think that's going to be a much closer competition. But as we look at the top domestic grossers of the decade, I think Barbie's going to end up behind Avatar: The Way of Water. And then we will see how its race with Top Gun Maverick turns out, although Maverick does keep closing that gap. There's another race, though, that Barbie's in, and it's the race for the 10th highest grossing movie of all time domestically. It is in that race with the movie Jurassic World from 2015. And when we look at their grosses day by day, Jurassic World is that navy blue line there on top. Barbie is, of course, the pink line. And you can see that Jurassic World has had a healthy margin over Barbie for basically the first month of each of their releases. But look at that gap closing slowly, slowly. Barbie could very well take that spot at number 10. Again, I think this is going to be a very close competition, but the momentum goes to Barbie as it continues to do well at a point where Jurassic World's curve was flattening a little bit. So it is very much within the realm of possibility that Barbie is one of the 10 highest grossing films of all time domestically. Kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum is Blue Beetle. Luckily, the movie didn't cost $200 million, but it's also not anywhere close to the highest grossing or one of the most successful films in the DC Extended Universe. Even if you want to argue that it's not part of the DCEU, but the DCU, the DC Universe that's upcoming, it's still coming out in the DCEU era. Looking at the franchise by domestic gross, I mean, in the emptiest of victories, it has now passed The Suicide Squad and Shazam! Fury of the Gods as the 11th highest grossing film in the DCEU, though it's unlikely to move up that chart much more. Maybe if it legs out incredibly well, it could pass Birds of Prey. I'm not quite sure about that. When you look at the franchise adjusted for inflation, it is still behind 2021's The Suicide Squad as the 12th highest grossing film in the DCEU. But when you look at it by worldwide gross, Blue Beetle is still in the basement. It needs to bank another $30 million if it wants to pass Shazam! Fury of the Gods. I mean, I think it can do that, but I don't know if it's got another 60 left in it to get past Wonder Woman 1984 and The Suicide Squad. We'll just have to see how it legs out. Again, maybe if it shows really, really good closing speed, then it could do that, but this has not been the breakout hit that I'm sure DC wanted, even at that lower budget point. One movie that has been a breakout hit is Oppenheimer, which much like Barbie, but in the background, as has been the case for the movie's entire run, is also doing its own work on the record books. These are the highest grossing R-rated films of all time worldwide, and Oppenheimer has bypassed both Deadpool movies now to become the second highest grossing R-rated film worldwide, behind only Joker, which made just over $1 billion a few years ago. We'll see how it does in China, how it continues to do internationally, how it continues to do domestically. I don't know if that $1 billion mark is within its grasp, but it's not completely out of the question. So Oppenheimer still with a lot of life left in it. It's also now the third highest grossing Christopher Nolan film worldwide. Basically, his highest grossing film that does not feature Batman, The Dark Knight Rises, is at number 1 at $1,081 million, and The Dark Knight is at number 2 with just over $1 billion. Oppenheimer moves past Inception now to third place, so a continued impressive run for Oppenheimer. And when we look at the highest grossing biopics worldwide, it is now within striking distance of Bohemian Rhapsody, which was a phenomenal success. That movie banked about $910.8 million. Oppenheimer's less than $60 million behind it, and if it continues to do well in China and in other countries internationally, then it could take number 1 on yet another chart. Cleaning up a few franchises that are still hanging around the box office. First, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem now has a lock on the fourth highest grossing film of the franchise, unadjusted for inflation, so it's the highest grossing film since 2014, and that's pretty much where it's going to stay. So definitely a break away from 2016's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows, and if there is a sequel, we'll see if it can be like Across the Spider-Verse, where it greatly outgrosses the original. I mentioned that Talk to Me is one of the sneakiest successes of the summer, and it is climbing up the highest grossing chart domestically for A24. It has now bypassed my beloved Hereditary. It's now the fourth highest grossing film of all time for A24 at $44.5 million. That passes Hereditary's mark of just over $44 million from several years ago. And if it hangs around, it could challenge potentially Lady Bird or even Uncut Gems for that number 3 or number 2 spot. So very much in the background, Talk to Me has been setting some good records. And then Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, it is out of the top 10. It'll be out of theaters before too long. And it continues to kind of have symbolic victories. It has now passed Mission Impossible 2 in the year 2000 for the fourth highest grossing film of all time in the franchise worldwide. But it is going to finish $100 million behind the lowest grossing of the sort of new crop of Mission Impossible films. That would be Rogue Nation. Ghost Protocol made $694.7 million. Fallout made $786.6 million. So we're seeing a big drop off between these films. This is much closer to where Mission Impossible was at the turn of the century than where it has been in the last several years. And Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 is one of many big box office stories that we were tracking this summer. The summer movie season is now officially over. A lot of times we're tracking one or two stragglers to see, oh, could they be a top 10 summer movie? But I think that we actually have our 10 pretty well settled. There's an outside chance maybe that one other movie could sneak in, but I don't really think that's going to happen. So here are the top 10 movies of the summer. There might be a couple of placement changes, but this is pretty much the top 10, unless again there's a big surprise. Barbie at number 1, of course, was $612.3 million. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the second highest grossing movie of the summer at $381.2 million, followed by Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 at $358.9 million, and Oppenheimer at $310.6 million. The Little Mermaid doesn't look like it's going to get over that $300 million mark, but it is the fifth highest grossing movie of the summer, followed by Sound of Freedom at number 6, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny at number 7, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 at number 8, Transformers Rise of the Beasts at number 9, and Elemental at number 10. And let's just dive into the summer movie season completely. First of all, let's look at what it did for the box office market share this year. This is the percentage of all tickets sold by each studio since January 1st. So as a reminder, this was how the market share looked back in May. This was at the beginning of the summer movie season. Universal had a big lead at 32.93%, really boosted by the Super Mario Brothers movie. Disney was there at 20%, Paramount at 9.7%, Sony had 7% of ticket sales, Amazon had 8.5%, Lionsgate at 10.5%. Warner was pushed to the margins. It actually had the lowest market share of any charted thing here at 5.39%. So let's look at what a summer does to the market share, and you can see that it's a pretty dramatic change. First of all, Universal went from 32% market share to 22% market share, and again, that's because it enjoyed that success of the Super Mario Brothers movie early in the year. Disney actually increased its market share a little bit to 24.32%, and I want you to note that these were the two studios so far this year that have sold the most tickets, Disney and Universal. Those two studios are important, and we'll see why in a little bit. Paramount was at 9.79%. After the summer, it really has not substantially improved its position at all. It's only about 1% more in market share, so really no breakout hits for the studio this summer, which is another thing that we will talk about. Remember, Warner Brothers was at just over 5%. It's added 10% market share through the summer, thanks to Barbie, really, first and foremost. Barbie is the reason why Warner Brothers even has a summer box office to speak of. Sony increased its market share thanks to movies like Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and Insidious The Red Door by almost 5%, so that's great for Sony. Amazon loses a lot of market share, and Lionsgate loses a lot because they didn't really compete in the summer box office season. It really has been a competition between the 5 major studios. And when we look at my predictions, I've been talking about this all summer. I think that I have some things to be proud of, and I have some things that I'm not so proud of. First of all, I am proud of the fact that I was able to accurately pick Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse as the second highest grossing film of the summer. It really wasn't that risky to pick Guardians 3 at number 3, but I had a lot of people tell me that I was picking Across the Spider-Verse way too high because of the performance of the first film. I just thought that the movie looked good. Spider-Man had such a huge hit after the release of Into the Spider-Verse, and that was an Oscar-winning movie. It had been on Netflix. People really loved that movie, and I just had a hunch that that movie was going to do really well. I didn't have a lot of great hunches this summer, but that was one of them. Of course, The Little Mermaid was my number 1 pick. I don't feel too bad about that. It still ended up down there at number 5. It just wasn't as successful as I thought it was going to be. Picking The Flash at number 4 was obviously my biggest mistake. I just completely bought into the hype around that movie. Remember when I picked this back in May, that was around the time that the hype was starting to crest off of CinemaCon, people saying it was an amazing movie, it was great, you got Michael Keaton coming back. I just really thought that it was going to catch on, and it didn't. Sometimes you just have a complete box office misfire. I usually have at least one every summer. The Flash was my box office misfire this summer. I was obviously also way too high on Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. I don't really have an explanation for that, and having seen the movie, I don't really think it's the movie's fault. It just didn't perform well. I was a little bit high on Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, but not that high. I was really much higher on Elemental than ended up being the case. I put it at 7th. Instead, it's in 10th place. Fast X is a movie that would be in the top 10 were it not for Sound of Freedom. So I don't feel bad about not picking Sound of Freedom because it wasn't even on the radar when I picked these movies back in late April, early May. And I don't really feel that bad about picking Fast X in the top 10 because it would have been had Sound of Freedom not come out of nowhere. So it's really just a lack of psychic powers and foresight than it was a bad pick. Probably the biggest criticism for me would be the number 9 and number 10 picks. I picked Oppenheimer at number 9 and Barbie at number 10. To be fair, a lot of people said that I shouldn't have picked Oppenheimer at all to be on my top 10 because it was going to be 3 hours long or it was going to be R-rated, and it ended up being a top 5 movie of the summer. It kind of broke all of the conventional rules for a successful film. And I remember when I picked Barbie, I literally said, I am putting Barbie on this list in case it turns out to be a massive hit, and I don't want to look stupid for not putting it on, because you have to understand that when I picked these movies, these top 10 summer movies, all we had of Barbie was one teaser that was based on 2001: A Space Odyssey that didn't really show much of the movie at all, and nobody really knew what this movie was going to be. What does a Greta Gerwig directed and co-written with Noah Baumbach Barbie movie look like? Yeah, it could be a hit, but it could be something completely crazy or off the wall or unexpected or unconventional, which it was, but it was in a way that audiences embraced it. So yes, it does look pretty bad for me to put the number 1 movie of the year worldwide, the number 1 movie of the year domestically, and the number 1 movie of the summer at number 10. But I will say that I went off the information that I had, and I did still put it on the list, even if I only put it at number 10. Again, because I had a hunch that it might do what it did, but I think that there are very few people out there, even 2 or 3 weeks before the movie's release, that really had huge faith in what Barbie was capable of. It's just a movie that turned out to be a phenomenon, and those movies are very difficult to predict. So the 2 movies that did make the top 10 that were not on my list were Sound of Freedom, which again, there's no way I would have picked that movie at the beginning of the summer, and then Transformers: Rise of the Beast, which I thought about picking, but again, the franchise seemed to be kind of on a decline, and it's only the number 9 movie of the summer, so I don't feel too bad about missing that pick. Overall, I would say that I'm somewhat pleased with my picks for this summer. I mean, I got 8 out of 10 with the wild card that was Sound of Freedom. I was right on a couple of picks. I was only really far off on 2 or 3 of them. Picking summer movies is really just for fun. It's almost like fantasy football. A lot of it is luck-based. You're making the best choice you can based on the information that you have at the time. There is a little bit of skill involved in that you have to know the basics of the box office, but a lot of it is also just luck-based. So in a luck-based system, I think I did okay with my predictions this summer, although I'm sure a lot of other people did even better, particularly the ones that were high on Barbie from the beginning. Your faith in that movie was rewarded. We have so much more to break down, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's episode. This video is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Signing your life away to a big wireless provider is kind of like being trapped on a roller coaster from hell. Ooh, look at all the pretty new phones and gadgets. Sure, where do I sign? But then comes the whiplash, month after month of crazy bills and unexpected thrills like overages and surprise fees. If that sounds like your current big wireless plan, it's time to get off the ride with Mint Mobile. For a limited time, wireless plans from Mint Mobile are just $15 a month. That's unlimited talk, text, and data for just $15 a month. If you look at your bill right now, I can almost guarantee that you're paying more than that. And if you go back and check, I bet you'd be shocked at just how much it's gone up over the last few months or years. It's something I'm glad I don't have to worry about anymore. Mint Mobile is simple and easy. All plans come with unlimited talk and text, plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network, and you can use your own phone and keep all your contacts. The process is quick and easy, and Mint has great customer service on hand if you have any questions. To get your new unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month and get the plan shipped to your door for free, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. That's mintmobile.com/Murrell. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/Murrell. This video is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Picture this, you're at a coffee shop enjoying a drink and doing some work when that coffee really hits you and you need to use the bathroom right away. Now, would you walk away and leave your computer open and unprotected? I mean, sure, it might be there when you get back, but do you want to take that chance? Well, every time you connect to an unencrypted network, any hacker on that same network can gain access to your personal data with some cheap hardware and basic knowledge. That's why you need ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN creates a secure, encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet so that hackers can't steal your sensitive data. Just fire up the app, click one button, and you are protected on your phone, your laptop, your tablet, and more so you can stay secure on the go. I love knowing that I'm getting ExpressVPN's protection no matter where I am. A couple of weeks ago, I used my computer in an airport, on a plane, and at a hotel, and not once did I give the security of my personal information a second thought because I was connected to ExpressVPN the whole time. If you're not worried about your data security, then you should be, and if you are, then you need ExpressVPN because it provides security and peace of mind. Secure your online data today by visiting expressvpn.com/Murrell. That's expressvpn.com/Murrell, and you can get an extra 3 months free. expressvpn.com/Murrell. So let's talk summer box office winners and losers, and the first winner is pretty obvious. It is Barbie, which had a budget of $145 million. Currently, it has a worldwide gross of $1.38 billion and $612 million domestically. That gross is going to go up over time. It's the highest grossing film in Warner Brothers history, domestic and worldwide. It's the highest grossing film directed or co-directed by a woman domestically and may take that record worldwide. Currently, it's the 13th highest grossing film of all time domestically and the 15th highest grossing film of all time worldwide. I mean, really, what's left to be said about Barbie? This is my latest profit breakdown. When you only take into account global box office receipts, I estimate that it has turned or will turn a theatrical profit of over $300 million, and that is before you factor in home video, digital rentals, product tie-ins, any of that. It's very likely that Barbie will be a windfall to the studio and to Mattel and everybody else of over $500 million. You don't see these movies very often. They're like unicorns. You're lucky if you get maybe 1 or 2 a year. And Barbie is one of those movies, one of the unreserved success stories of 2022. And that's really when I call a movie a winner. I mean, it's not one of those like, oh, well, you know, I think that it's going to end up being okay. When I say a movie's a winner, I mean it has shown a clear ability to profit in the theatrical window. Audiences showed up, and it's going to make the studio money. I mean, paired with Barbie, as it has been all summer, is Oppenheimer, another box office winner, a budget of about $100 million. It's the highest grossing film to never be #1 at the domestic box office, the best non-Batman opening in Christopher Nolan's career, the highest grossing domestic non-Batman film for Christopher Nolan, and the highest grossing non-Batman film for Nolan worldwide, also the second highest grossing R-rated film of all time worldwide, as we noted. Studios often don't have faith in an audience, but Christopher Nolan is a filmmaker who's not afraid to challenge his audience. I think that he challenged them a little bit too much with Tenet, which I thought was messy and just a little bit muddled. I couldn't quite get what he was going for, but I think that Oppenheimer is, in my opinion, his best film, and people have been showing up for this movie. I think that it was smart to hype it with the 70mm and the IMAX because it drove demand. It drove people out to want to see it as an event instead of just another movie that's coming out. I've seen it twice now. I look forward to seeing it many, many more times over the course of my life. And this is just one of those movies, again, I say you can't predict what's going to happen during the summer. This was the anti-summer movie, and yet it became a top 5 summer hit. So sometimes you just have to roll the dice and see what's going to happen. And looking at my latest profit breakdown, and again, these are just my estimates, I believe that it's going to bring in over $100 million in theatrical profit for the investors. And keep in mind, that's after Nolan takes his 20% top dollar gross cut, which for this movie right now equals over $75 million. So Christopher Nolan bet on himself. He bet on the audience. Well, that is a bet that is literally paying off. And that profit is just going to go up as Oppenheimer continues to play in international markets. A controversial box office winner, but a box office winner nonetheless, is Sound of Freedom. It was produced a long time ago on a budget reportedly of $14.5 million. It has so far grossed $185 million plus worldwide. $181 million of that is domestic. It's just now rolling out around the world. It had a promotional budget of $5 million that was crowdfunded. The investors were paid back at 1.2 times their investment. And then, of course, the Pay It Forward program. As of today, 17.2 million tickets have been purchased through the Pay It Forward program. They're sold at $15 each, which means that over $250 million worth of tickets for this movie have been sold. If not one single person actually paid to go see this movie, Angel Studios would still have over $70 million in extra funding left over. But of course, there are a lot of people that did pay their own way to see Sound of Freedom. By my estimates, given the actual box office gross and the leftover Pay It Forward ticket sales, Angel Studios could bring in $150, $200 million from just this movie, and that goes toward hosting and distributing Sound of Freedom online after its theatrical run. But by the bylaws and by the thing that you sign when you buy one of these Pay It Forward tickets, it can also be shifted to other projects within the company. So I'm going to look at the other big 5 studios in just a moment as far as profitability and who made the most money. But if you look at the overall sphere, I think that Angel Studios, and not by a small margin, stands to clear the most money from the theaters this summer, and that's because of their unconventional strategy with this movie. And it's even more surprising when you realize that Sound of Freedom did not even have a release date when the summer movie season began back in May. The release date was announced on May 11th after Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 was released, and this was really just a word-of-mouth hit that kept on growing. We talked about this movie a few minutes ago, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, reportedly produced on a budget of $100 million. Some people have been skeptical about that, but I don't have any other sources saying that it was not that figure. Grossed $686 million worldwide, $381 million domestic. It had the 3rd best opening domestically for a Spider-Man film. It is the 4th highest domestic grossing Spider-Man film. It doubled the domestic gross of its predecessor, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and outgrossed Into the Spider-Verse by over $300 million worldwide. And it is also the highest grossing comic book film of 2023 so far domestically. Again, just a solid performing movie. It was not a record smasher, but it did well. It built on its predecessor, and it created demand, it seems like, for the Part 2 movie, which was supposed to come out early next year, but looks like it's going to be, well, it is going to be pushed past early next year. We'll see when it actually does end up coming out. Maybe the holidays of 2024, maybe early 2025. It just depends on when this movie is done, and also when it can be animated in a way that doesn't open itself up to many of the criticisms that this movie was opened up to as far as the workload on its animators. Another solid grosser was Insidious: The Red Door, which was produced on a budget of $16 million and grossed $186 million worldwide and $82 million domestically. You saw that I had a margin of about $20+ million as far as profit, and some people would say, like, well, why is it so low based on a budget of $16 million? I did give it a pretty healthy marketing budget, over double what the initial budget for the film was. So if that marketing budget was lower, then the take home is even more. The Red Door had the second best domestic opening weekend in franchise history. It also has the second highest franchise domestic gross, only $1.5 million behind Insidious Chapter 2. It is the highest grossing Insidious film worldwide. It is also the highest grossing 2023 horror film worldwide. Another movie that was not a record breaker, but just was a solid performer, was Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. It had that massive budget of $250 million plus marketing and promotion, so that kept its return down, but I still project it to be profitable in the theatrical window. It had an $844 million worldwide gross, a $358 million domestic gross, the highest grossing comic book movie of 2023 worldwide. The Guardians franchise thus far, and this seems like it could be the end of it, has earned just over $1 billion domestically and $2.48 billion worldwide. This is an example for the MCU of a movie that performed as expected. It did not exceed expectations. It didn't really underperform expectations considering the shrinking of the global market, especially for MCU films in the last few years. It was just a dependable, reliable movie. Maybe the studio would have wished that it had made more money in the theatrical window, but it didn't lose money. And as we'll see with Disney, that has been the exception rather than the rule, particularly this summer. It pains me to call this a box office loser, and I'm not necessarily saying that it is going to not be a profitable film, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but I have to call Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 a loser as far as expectation, what people thought the movie was going to do, and also performance based on quality. This was a critical hit, an audience hit. It had a massive budget, $290 million. Part of that is because it was blown up by COVID with COVID delays, but it only grossed $560 million worldwide and $170 million domestic. Those would be respectable numbers if the budget was about half as big. It's the second lowest domestic gross in Mission Impossible franchise history, only about $37 million higher than Mission Impossible 3. And remember, that's before you adjust for inflation. And it also grossed over $225 million less worldwide than the last Mission Impossible film, which was Fallout. That was a franchise high gross. Filming began in September 2020 after a 6-month delay due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Part 2 began filming reportedly back in March of 2022. It stopped down shooting, and now the shooting is suspended due to the SAG-AFTRA strike. And I mean, these two movies have been cursed. They're going to shoot the first one. They get shut down because of COVID. They have to finish shooting during COVID, which is extra expense. They start shooting the sequel. They decide to shut it down so they can get this movie to theaters. And by the time they're ready to restart shooting on the sequel, there's another prolonged months-long work stoppage. I mean, this is literally lightning striking twice for Dead Reckoning Part 1, and yet they have to deal with it. And it could be that the budget takes another hit for the sequel whenever it does make it to theaters. Like I said, I don't want to call it a loser, but given the franchise history and the trajectory and the expectations and the critical reaction, it is shocking to me that this movie didn't do better. Part of it is that it got swallowed up by the Barbenheimer fallout. Part of it is that it gave away all of its premium screens after 1 week. It's just a poor release strategy, especially in hindsight. And when I look at this profit breakdown, this is my latest calculation. I estimate that it needs about $150 million more in theatrical revenue to break even in the theatrical window. And when I say that, I'm not necessarily saying that it's going to lose money. That's because, well, I mean, yeah, $155 million looks like a lot, but not every movie is created equal. And with Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, first of all, there are a lot of promotional partners and tie-ins and people that paid to be part of the publicity campaign for this movie. When we look at that $155 million, that just means for this movie to break even, it has to make up that gap in theatrical revenue. I think that the marketing and tie-ins and stuff are going to close that gap a little bit. I think it's a movie that will be successful in the physical media, in the premium video on demand, and the digital market. And I think it's a franchise that, of course, Paramount Plus is going to run this movie as an exclusive for a while to draw people to their streaming service. But I think it's an appealing film for other people to license. So if they go to a cable network, if they go to another streamer and say that we want to license Dead Reckoning Part 1, I think that it could draw a respectable figure. So that's why I'm saying that even though there is a shortfall in the theatrical revenue for this movie, I'm not necessarily saying it's going to lose money. However, that doesn't make it not a disappointment. And I think it is a disappointing movie. There's really no argument over Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken. It had a budget of $70 million, which is fairly low for an animated film, but it grossed just $42 million worldwide and $15 million domestically, which means when you factor in the money that it cost to market the movie, a projected loss of approximately $100 million theatrically for Universal and DreamWorks. It was the worst opening in DreamWorks animation history, the lowest domestic gross in DreamWorks animation history, the second lowest worldwide gross in DreamWorks animation history, behind only Spirit Untamed, and it is outside the top 50 2023 domestic grossers. This movie just didn't catch on. Nobody cared about it. I know that sucks for people that worked on it very hard, very long hours. You know, animation is not easy, but no one was interested in Ruby Gillman, and it just flopped. I mean, it is an out and out flop, no question about it. As was this movie. This is the sneaky huge flop of the summer that not a lot of people are talking about because the same studio also had big flops. Haunted Mansion had a reported $150 million budget. Its gross right now is just at $100 million worldwide, $64 million domestically. That puts it, I project, at a loss of nearly $200 million in the theatrical window for Disney, and I'm sorry, there is no way they are making up that revenue through any ancillary stream, especially because Haunted Mansion is not a movie that's going to have action figures and all of these other tie-ins like some of the other films that we talk about. It had a lower opening weekend in domestic gross than 2003's The Haunted Mansion starring Eddie Murphy. Originally scheduled to open on August 11th, eventually it was opened on July 28th behind Barbenheimer. That was a great idea. The premiere was also disrupted by the beginning of the SAG-AFTRA strike, which prohibited the stars from attending. This movie should have been delayed at some point to fall. I don't know why it was moved up even more into the teeth of the summer movie season. I don't know if this movie ever would have been a box office hit, but I don't think it would have been this big of a flop if it had moved out of the theatrical window that it currently occupies. But in any other summer, this would be the flop that everybody was talking about, but it just so happens that there were a couple of movies that did even worse than Haunted Mansion. One of those movies is The Flash. With a reported budget before marketing of $225 million, there was a brief moment where there were reports that it was even higher, but it turns out that appears to have been a misunderstanding. So with that $225 million budget, even if all of that money came back from the box office, it only made $267 million worldwide and $108 million domestically. So it would just barely have made money if theaters didn't take a cut and if no marketing money was put into the movie, but that's not how the box office works. It has a projected loss to Warner Brothers of over $200 million. That studio should be kissing the ground that Greta Gerwig walks on, because they would have absolutely been in the dumpster if not for Barbie this summer. It's the 6th consecutive DCEU financial disappointment, plagued of course by the off-camera actions of the movie star. The original announced release date for a Flash movie was March 23rd, 2018, so 5 years to make it into theaters. Phil Lord and Chris Miller, Seth Grahame-Smith, Rick Famuyiwa, John Francis Daley, and Jonathan Goldstein all involved with this project at some point and left, and this movie ended up as a financial disaster for Warner Brothers and DC, only to be topped by Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Again, a massive budget, partially inflated by COVID at $295 million. But again, I think I referenced this story. I was reading an article before the movie came out in Empire, and one of the writers of the film was talking about writing the movie and saying, well, the great thing about writing an Indiana Jones film is nobody ever comes in and says that what you're writing is too expensive. Well, that was pretty obvious given the budget of the movie, and somebody should have, because there was really no regard to what would happen if this movie was a financial failure, and it was a financial failure. $295 million budget before you spend $1 on marketing, before you give $1 back to theaters, a $371 million gross worldwide, and a $174 million gross domestic. A projected loss, according to my numbers, of over $200 million for Disney. This is one of the biggest financial failures of all time, if not the biggest financial failure of all time. The lowest grossing Indiana Jones film ever domestically, unadjusted for inflation, meaning you put it up against movies that came out 30 plus years ago, it still loses. It'll gross less than half of what Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull grossed worldwide. And again, originally was supposed to release on July 19th, 2019, then July 2020, July 2021, July 2022, and then finally June 30th, 2023. Of course, some of those delays were due to the pandemic, but still, this movie took so long to make, and they spent so much in production, it would have had to have cleared a massive bar, and it did not clear that bar. It is the biggest financial failure of the summer, along with The Flash. They're like 1A and 1B. The difference for Disney is that they did not have a Barbie to bail them out. So how did the big 5 studios do this summer? Well, I've put them in order of what I have determined. This is not official numbers, but I have determined to be the biggest loser, to the biggest winner. And remember earlier in the show when we were looking at that market share chart and I said that Disney and Universal had sold the most tickets this year? Well, this is just an indication of why that's not the only metric you need to look at when you're looking at box office success. Let's start with Disney. I have as its wins this summer only Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which I project to break even in the theatrical window. Of course, it'll make substantially more with ancillary markets. 3 movies I think could break even with ancillary markets, which I consider to be merchandising, video on demand, etc. The Boogeyman, which just fell short of being profitable in the theatrical window. I think that movie's going to eventually break even. Elemental, the head of Pixar, said that the movie is going to break even. I don't project that it has done so theatrically, although it has certainly improved its standing since it opened, so its longevity at the worldwide and the domestic box office has helped its odds. I do not put it down as a failure. I think it is likely to break even. Now, some people would say, how could you put The Little Mermaid on this list when it has fallen short, according to your calculations, over $100 million of breaking even at the theatrical box office? And I'll tell you why. It's like I said earlier, not every movie is created equal. So I'm looking at a $115 million revenue gap, basically, for this movie to break even. Do I think that The Little Mermaid is going to sell $115 worth of merchandise, is going to pull in over $115 million when you bring in physical media sales and video on demand rentals, etc.? Yeah, I think that it is likely or possible that it will. Certainly not to the point where I'm going to say The Little Mermaid is a failure. I think that it is one of those movies that has the promotional tie-ins and the merchandising to close that gap. And so I'm not going to write it off as a failure. There are actually only 2 movies from Disney, but they are big ones that I'm writing off as financial failures. Haunted Mansion, which I projected again will lose almost $200 million theatrically for the studio, and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which I project will lose $215 million for the studio. And really driven by those theatrical losses, I estimate that Disney lost over $600 million at the box office this year, which again means when I look at all of these movies, do I think that all of the ancillary markets for these 6 films could make up that $620 million gap? I do not. So by my projection, I believe that when all is said and done, even with all markets considered, Disney will come out of the summer 2023 box office in the red, that they will lose money, and it's largely because their budgets were just so high. Yes, COVID was part of it, but that's not the only factor. They thought that they were invincible, and really, recent history has shown that Disney is pretty much invincible at the box office. While 2023 is the summer that Disney became mortal, not just at the summer box office, but in so many ways, and I project them to be the loser, studio-wise, of the summer. Universal, actually, the other movie that's been dominating ticket sales, I say is likely to lose some money, but certainly not to the extent that Disney is. First of all, let's look at the studio's wins this summer. Oppenheimer, obviously, over $100 million and climbing in theatrical revenue. Some movies that I think could break even when you consider ancillary markets. Book Club: The Next Chapter, which lost about $25 million theatrically. I think it can close that gap. Strays, which lost about $60 million. I almost put that in the failures list, but comedies can do well, and they're also somewhat in demand for different people that might want to license that movie. So I am putting it as a very fringe, could break even. And then again, another movie, Fast X, $150 million shortfall when you look at ticket sales. Obviously, Universal would have wanted this movie to do so much better than it did. But given this movie, all of the promotional tie-ins, all of the other ancillary markets, could Fast X close a $150 million gap? I don't think it's easy, but I'm not going to write it off as an absolute failure. I think that it could be a break-even or close to a break-even movie for Universal. But the thing is, I don't think that Universal wants a Fast and Furious movie to be just a break-even movie. That's a studio determination. My job is to look at the box office and make those determinations. So I'm not writing Fast X off as a failure necessarily, but it's another one that I think is a disappointment. No questions about it. There are 2 movies that I wrote off as financial failures. The Last Voyage of the Demeter, which actually lost about the same theatrically as Strays, but I think it doesn't have as much appeal in the secondary markets. And then Ruby Gillman Teenage Kraken, which is just going to lose the studio a lot of money with its $100 million shortfall. So I'm looking at estimated total box office losses of about $288.6 million. I think that it's possible to maybe close that gap, but I think it is more likely that the studio is going to lose some money, but not a lot of money. So a busy summer for Universal, but I don't think they're going to have a whole lot to show for it other than, of course, Oppenheimer. And keep in mind, this was the first project that Universal has done with Christopher Nolan in recent history, and it's largely because Nolan got angry with the whole HBO Max moves. If they hadn't done that, if HBO Max hadn't sent all of their movies to theaters and streaming day and date, it's possible that Warner Brothers would have had both Barbie and Oppenheimer. Now, they wouldn't have opened them on the same weekend, but the studio could have had both movies. However, a different regime decided to make those moves, and we saw Nolan jump over to Universal. The jury is out for me on Paramount, so they don't have any wins that I can say, oh, well, this movie definitely turned a big profit in the theatrical window, but they also didn't have any massive failures in the sense that I can say, oh, well, this movie definitely is going to lose them a lot of money. They had 3 major releases, and all 3 are not money earners theatrically, but I think all have the potential to close that gap. I think the easiest one, and I almost put it down as a win, is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. Currently, it has about a $60 million shortfall by my estimations in the theatrical window. I think given publicity, promotion, merchandising, etc., even if not all of it goes back to Paramount, I think that it is going to be a profitable market. Transformers Rise of the Beast, another movie, it fell short about $100 million theatrically, but it also has promotional partners and merchandising, other ways that you can bring in money. So I think it's possible it could break even. And then Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, it certainly has its work cut out for it, but I'm not going to write that off as a failure either, because that perhaps has the biggest partner campaign as far as people that paid to be a part of the movie. So I'm saying that this is kind of a TBD. I think that the studio's profit is dependent on these other ancillary markets. Currently, it has lost about $328.1 million theatrically, but I don't think it's out of the question that the secondary markets on these 3 films could close that gap. So really kind of a wait and see on these 3 films and for Paramount altogether. In the runner-up position, I put Sony. It had 2 verifiable wins for the summer, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and Insidious: The Red Door, which combined brought in about $150 million in theatrical revenue alone. Then you had 4 films that I think could break even in ancillary markets. First of all, we have Gran Turismo, which is still in theaters, about a $70 million shortfall, but some box office ahead of it. The Equalizer 3 just opened in theaters. It's at less than $100 million to close that revenue gap for being profitable theatrically, and it is also very appealing. Keep in mind, Sony does not have a streaming service, so all of these movies are part of an existing licensing deal that Sony has with Netflix, so Sony is guaranteed ancillary income for licensing probably all of these films, and it's also licensable to other places. It does not have to go to a Sony streaming service, so I think that it's likely that all of these movies almost likely will turn a profit because of the licensing deals over time. Love Again, I think, eventually would turn a profit. It lost about $14.5 million theatrically. No Hard Feelings, I wish this movie had had a smaller budget. It lost about $60 million. I almost wrote it off as a failure, but again, the comedies, they have a great appeal for people to rent at home. You can license them. So I'm saying it could break even. The only real failure I'm putting down for Sony was The Machine. They invested a lot of money into that movie. It seemed to have a very limited market appeal. I don't really see a path to profitability for that film, so I'm writing it off as a failure. But current total box office losses for Sony, I have at $127.2 million. I think it is almost probable that that gap is going to be closed, and so my verdict with Sony is that they are very likely to make some money this summer at the box office. And that leaves just one studio, and it's a situation that reminded me of a clip that's been circulating after the death of Bob Barker, one of the greatest TV show hosts of all time. He hosted The Price is Right for years. There's a famous clip where there's a contestant who's playing one of the games, and she just doesn't get the game. She keeps trying to reuse numbers. You have to write 5 numbers down to win a car, and Bob has to keep explaining the rules, and it takes like 5 minutes. She has 10 tries, and she's heinously wrong on every one of the tries. And then on the last try, she writes down the correct number and she wins the car. And somehow the most inept contestant in Price is Right history walked away with the biggest prize that the show has to offer. That's how I feel about Warner Brothers Discovery, because they had one of the biggest flops of all time this summer, along with 2 other movies that it's going to take a little bit of work to get to profitability. And yet, because they had one major hit, they will be coming out on top of the summer box office. Of course, I'm talking about Barbie. I estimate that Barbie is going to bring in $342 million of theatrical revenue alone and climbing, probably over $500 million when you include all markets. That's the only win of the summer for Warner Brothers. As far as breaking even with ancillary markets, I have Meg 2, The Trench. Right now, it's about $55 million short of that theatrical window profitability. I think it's going to close that gap fairly easily. And then even Blue Beetle, it's at over $100 million short, but I think that that's appealing. You could have some merchandising. It's likely that it's probably going to lose a little bit of money, but I didn't want to write it off as a failure. The only real failure is The Flash. I mean, good gracious, $200 million loss for the studio, and they still win the summer because I estimate that they've only lost, Warner Brothers, theatrically, remember, theatrically, only based on ticket sales, $21.3 million, which means that they will profit hundreds of millions of dollars based on their summer box office. Looking at all of the studios, this is the only studio that I can say with conviction that they will be easily profitable for the summer. And so Warner Brothers, because of Barbie, is the summer box office winner. One movie saved an entire studio's bacon and really made it the only breakout studio of the year. Barbie is just one of those movies. You know, they say that a movie can save Hollywood. Well, I don't know if Barbie saved Hollywood, and I don't know if Barbie saved Warner Brothers overall, but Barbie absolutely saved summer 2023 and absolutely saved Warner Brothers in summer 2023. Well, this has been a long show already, so let's sprint to the finish here and look at our last few charts. Let's look first at the 2023 domestic box office annually. No change from last week, so we won't run over the whole thing. Barbie, the Super Mario Brothers movie, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Guardians 3, and Oppenheimer remain your top 5 domestically for 2023, but some big changes on the 2023 worldwide box office chart. First of all, Barbie, now officially the highest grossing movie of the year worldwide at $1.384 billion, bypasses the Super Mario Brothers movie at $1.359 billion, and Oppenheimer passes Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. The Christopher Nolan R-rated A-bomb movie outgrosses the MCU at the worldwide box office. That is insane. $853.5 million. Guardians 3 bumps down to number 4 at $845.5 million. Fast X remains at number 5, and then 6 through 10 remain the same. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Full River Red, The Wandering Earth 2, The Little Mermaid, and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Remember when we were talking about the weekend box office? That was a while ago. Well, let's loop back to that real quick and look at the top 5 per theater averages for this past weekend. Limited release movies didn't make a huge impact, so The Equalizer 3 actually had the best per theater average for September 1st through the 3rd at just over $8,700 per theater, followed by Bottoms at $4,200 per theater. That's because it was only in 715 theaters. Fremont, playing in 9 theaters, brought in $3,962 per theater, followed by Barbie at number 4, and Winter Kills, which has been hanging around mostly because it's only playing in a couple theaters nationwide, at $2,294 per theater. Looking at the movies in limited release, Bottoms once again tops the charts in 715 theaters at just over $3 million, followed by the Indian film Kushi. This is a Telugu language romantic comedy, bringing in just under $1 million in an unknown number of theaters as I was doing my research. Golda is in third place at $819,000, followed by the Indian film Mastani at $796,000, and then Hilary Swank's The Good Mother in 423 theaters at just over $300,000. Of course, all of these movies are likely to be found in independent theaters, which are spread out not only across the United States, but around the world. I skipped this last week, and I know it's a long show, but I didn't want to go 2 weeks in a row without spotlighting an indie theater. So this week we are going to the north of the United States, and in fact, north of the United States to Canada, to feature the Rio Theater in Vancouver, British Columbia. The Rio offers both live entertainment and movie screenings. It was built back in 1938 and seats over 400 patrons. It has been many things over the years, including a bowling alley and during COVID, a sports bar, because due to COVID regulations in Canada that allowed bars and restaurants to be open but not movie theaters, the Rio transformed itself into a sports bar, playing only sporting events to stay afloat. The theater almost fell prey to rezoning in 2017 in order to build new condominiums, but an outpouring of support and funds from the community allowed it to remain what it is now back to post-COVID, which is an indie single-screen theater. You can snack on traditional theater fare as well as grilled cheese sandwiches and a full bar. Coming up in November is the annual Rio Grind Film Festival, a 4-day exhibition of the best modern overlooked grindhouse-style films. This week, you can catch Tank Girl with a live Q&A with director Rachel Talalay. You can catch The Faculty. You can catch a burlesque cancer fundraiser, Past Lives, The Breakfast Club. There's really a little bit of everything going on at the Rio. For ticket sales and more, you can check out riotheater.ca. And if you end up going, be sure to tell them, as always, that Dan sent you. Let's close out the show now with the box office flashback, looking at a weekend in box office history. I have been doing at the very end of the show something I call Rotten Tomatoes Decoded, where I look at the reviews for recent movies. I break down the tomato meter versus the average rating. I've decided to move that over into another show that I've started, which is my Coming Soon show. So at the beginning of every week, I take a look at everything that's coming out in theaters, on streaming, on broadcast, and I wanted to incorporate, and actually have wanted to incorporate, streaming shows into that Rotten Tomatoes thing that I've been doing, but it didn't feel like a great fit on a box office show. So what I've decided to do is to take that feature, move it to the Coming Soon show, and that will now include theatrical films, streaming series, streaming movies, etc. It's not going to get unwieldy, don't worry, but it just felt like a better fit, and it shortened this show. And if there's ever been a case for this show needing to be shortened, it's this week's episode. So from now on, we will be closing out with the box office flashback, and we are going back to Labor Day weekend of 1989, September 1st through the 4th. The number one movie was Uncle Buck in its third week of release with $7.8 million in Labor Day ticket sales, followed closely by Ron Howard's Parenthood at $7.4 million. That movie made $100 million back in 1989. In third place, James Cameron's The Abyss in week 4, somewhat of a financial disappointment for James Cameron, and the last movie he ever made, I think, that you could call a financial disappointment in any way, shape, or form. $5.5 million in third place there. In fourth place was When Harry Met Sally in week 8 at $4.8 million, and close behind was Lethal Weapon 2 in week 9 at $4.6 million. So mainly summer holdovers there in the top 5 on Labor Day weekend 1989. But of course, we don't just like to leave those numbers where they are. We like to push that inflation button to see what they look like in today's dollars. And when you do that, that would put Uncle Buck on top at $19.2 million, on its way to a $164.5 million domestic gross. Parenthood in second place at $18.4 million, on a way to a final domestic gross of almost $250 million adjusted for inflation. The Abyss at $13.6 million, that would have put it at over $100 million adjusted for inflation that weekend, and a final adjusted total of $133.7 million. When Harry Met Sally would bring in another $11.9 million on its way to a final total of $228.8 million. But the biggest box office hit on this chart was Lethal Weapon 2, which made $11.4 million adjusted for the weekend, on its way to a final total of $363 million. And that wraps it up for charts this week. Hopefully the length of this episode will demonstrate why I was later than usual on the upload. Listen, if I didn't have to sleep, I would have had it up on time. But, you know, there's only so many functional hours of the day. Thank you so much for watching. I should be back at the normal time next week to talk about the box office weekend as we get into a bit of a lull here. So this could be one of the last packed episodes of the show for quite some time. But of course, stay tuned right here on the channel for movie news, reviews, box office, of course, a look at what's coming up next week, at the end of this week, and even more. Thank you so much for watching and hanging around for this episode and for the entire summer, and I hope you hang around for the fall movie season. I want to thank our sponsors, which you can find down in the description below, and also make sure to check the description for 2 different causes that I'm supporting for the duration of the strikes: the Entertainment Community Fund and the Go for PAs Alliance. 5% of all my revenue, ad revenue here on YouTube, will be going to those 2 organizations, split between the 2. You can find more info for them down there. Thank you for spending part of your day with me, though, first and foremost. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.